Hi, everybody. I'm Dan, SF District Manager of Paradise Rec and Park District. Very much appreciate you coming out tonight. We have some interesting updates. What I wanted to make clear that we have a series of these coming up, and we'll have some additional findings and information to come. But this whole process we thought would be important to kind of give you a peek as we go, and then for us to get feedback too. So on anything from information you hear, how we can better improve getting the word out, to materials you might have online. By the way, we have been putting all of this each night. So if you want to binge watch these shows, you can watch them online, and we'll have this recording up with the PDF and other materials too. Just one quick thing, wanted to acknowledge a Town of Paradise as not only a great partner, but they provided food tonight, which is, so thank you for that, Susan and the team there. Everybody in the room here has a name tag, and Sunny, do you want to come up and share with us a little bit about what that program is? Uh-oh, Sunny's talking. Do you want to do it? Okay. Scott, we'll give a little presentation on just what this is all about.
They put me in front of a microphone. I know. On purpose. So the Networking Neighborhoods Grant was handed down by the Office of the Governor, and it's at the tune of $750,000 to specifically get us to know each other, so that when the next emergency comes, you know your neighbor's name, and you might even know the person right here next to you. We have many zones that have been created on top of the, I think, are those the evac zones, Dan? So the evac zones are your town zone. The goal is to get you to meet someone from another zone. We started today with a fun fact about yourself. So if you've got something you see on someone else you really appreciate, feel free to introduce them to one of your new friends. That's the basis of events by PRPD as well as our community partners through the funding and pass through of that $750,000 over the course of the next year and a half. For questions, well, visit our website.
Or talk to Scott at the end. So just a couple of things. This is what we're going to talk about today. So we have the welcome here. Then we're going to go through a quick, very brief introduction to the overall project. Again, I would refer to not only our website, which is getting more information, but there's a couple of handouts in the back that have a description. And if you don't, I think we probably are short on them, but that gives a good description of this overall project. So those are good bits of information. We're going to go through the fire pathways modeling, which I think there were a lot of questions last time. We have a more refined look at that tonight that Scott Farley will provide. Then we're going to look at catastrophe models. That was going to be based on the results of the fire pathways. So that's a little bit behind, but we'll get an update on that from Ken on that. Then we're going to go to an actuarial model update on that same status. And then something that's important for us is we want to get feedback from the community. It's not just the fire pathways part, but there's other layers that are important to the community. And we make sure we capture that and just kind of like local knowledge. So making sure that we're addressing issues that folks in the room may know about. So we want to make sure that we have that. We're going to go through this stuff pretty quickly. We have a timer that is going to keep us on schedule, but we're going to kind of try and get through the presentations, have that flow go through, and then we'll take questions and answers after a break. So I just want to give you some forewarning on that. If we have sufficient time, we might get a quick question here or there, but we'll try and get through the presentation and then come back to it. We have ample time for that at the end here. So again, going back to that material I provided, what we're exploring is the idea of a defensible space, not just around a home or a building or important infrastructure. What might it look like if we have defensible space around an entire community? So kind of a landscape scale or community scale. And that has big implications on us for looking at where we are with our protection of the community, and there could be multiple benefits to that. We have a grant here with the BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. That's what's funding this. We've had a lot of good partners along the way that have helped us with that along the way. And I'm just going to go through a couple of these things here. And I think I might be, just a few things about that, and then we'll jump into the next section here. So primary purpose, again, is looking at these strategically located. We call them wildlife risk reduction buffer. Also, I think a good handle for them too is resiliency parks, and there could be other names too, open space and so forth. But just kind of have that protection around the community. This thing is generated around questions. So this first part is definitely a scientific exploration of whether this is a good idea or not. And then what we have here is, just to summarize some of this, maybe a little small font for you. Most important fire pathways into the community, costs and benefits. This is a requirement if we need to do any future funding request. Needs to have a positive cost benefit analysis on it. Public ownership, is it retained in private hands with some sort of models and mechanisms to help fund that work on the ground? It's a really important step. Most appropriate land uses. Now we're looking at from an ecological standpoint, not a planning standpoint, but what do those fuels need to look like on the ground? So I think that's quite a bit different than, say, a general plan approach that the city, the town and county may have. Cost-effective, strategic, and sustainable approaches. What I mean by that is it needs to last for the long term. So if we get initial funding, it needs to have funding mechanisms that will take care of it in perpetuity and protect the community. And if we can't do that, then it's probably not going to be a good idea. And then community support for the project. I have some other items talking about the task, but I think we want to keep on task with it. So I'm going to, I think we're now kicking over to Scott Farley with the fire pathways. Oh, is Dave here?
All right, confirm you guys can hear me now?
Hi, Dave. I can't hear you.
You can? Okay. Do you have our slides or am I able to share? I don't think I've been promoted to panelist.
Make you a panelist. All right, Dave, we're ready for you to share.
Okay. All right, confirming you have the Paradise Vegetation Treatment Plan slide up.
Yep, and you sound good.
Okay, outstanding. Well, thank you for the opportunity. We've really enjoyed working on this project and being able to learn not only from the local folks who are have the familiarity with the landscape, but also having had the opportunity to learn more about how our treatment and our treatment recommendations, how they could be implemented. Obviously, discussing wildfire is interesting. Mitigating wildfire is fascinating, and we're excited about the potential this project has to move from discussion to execution. So without any further ado, I'll walk through the methodology and some of our findings. All right, so just as we previously discussed, and I think this is very important beginning of the discussion, is that what we are looking at in this, our modeling of the risk and our recommended mitigations is how to interdict a fast-moving wind-driven fire that has the potential to outpace the firefighting response. So looking at fires that are moving with greater relative speed than the response. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, this is not a particularly new idea. Jack Cohn first outlined this in the early 2000s with his WUI disaster sequence, specifically looking at how we avoid getting to stage 5 and stage 6 of the sequence where firefighting resources are overwhelmed, allowing for an uninterrupted urban conflagration, that is structure to structure fire spread through our dense suburban and urban settings. And the reason I think this is so important is that outside of the dense urban and suburban settings, we know exactly what needs to be done to protect the homes. That is either 7A construction for new homes or home hardening retrofits, Class A roof coverings, ember resistant vents, et cetera, and defensible space. The science is very clear. If the home is surrounded by things other than homes, those mitigations are very effective and have been a matter of state law since 1967 in the form of defensible space, in 2008 in the form of CBC 7A. It is when the home is within 50 feet structure separation distance of another home that we have the potential for urban conflagration, where the flux produced by an adjacent burning structure can overwhelm the engineered limitations, essentially design parameters of dispensable space and home hardening. So it's critical that we understand how fire is going to get into our community and specifically how fast moving fire is going to get into our community, because that is the fire that will overwhelm the firefighting response. It is worthy of note that in day 4, 5, 6, 7 of some of our larger campaign fires, the number of structures lost falls off dramatically as the firefighting response fills out. And as the incident command is established, as fire camps go up, as mutual aid resources from out the state or throughout the West respond. And it is in those initial operating periods when we lose the most number of structures, because we have not yet had time to mobilize our firefighting response. And it is during those periods that our passive pre-fire mitigation measures are going to have the greatest value, because they will always be in place. All right, so what we've done is we started off with identifying the values at risk, that being the identified suburban and urban settings that we are concerned about. We identify the pathways that will bring fire into those areas, and we identify the entry points from which we can then, so that's out to in and then in to out. We can then work back out from the values at risk, working our way upstream of the pathways that enter the community, and look for those opportunities to put targeted treatments, splats, pods, small, discrete, specifically located wildfire risk reduction treatments in the form of vegetation management, where they have the highest potential of interdicting the nodes and edges that form the fire pathway. And what that looks like when it comes together, here's just a simple graphic showing how a fire pathway, that combination of topography, weather, and fuel, that can bring fire into the community. And we see in the very top where fire runs by the barn and into those agricultural lands that are modeled, that has the effect of stopping the fire. That pathway is mitigated by existing features. And in the bottom, we see a pathway where the fire comes down into the community and it runs into an area of mitigated fuel and hardened homes and is never able to enter the community. And it is that center pathway where we see fire finding the combination of vegetation and unprotected homes that allow it make entry into the community, where homes can potentially become the fuel most likely to carry the fire. So in the case specifically of this project, we looked at Concal, Magalia, and Paradise as the values at risk, and we ran 2 scenarios. We looked at a northeast scenario using the weather that was present on the day the campfire burned, and then a southwest fire scenario looking at weather predominated by west or southwest winds coming up off of 99, running up the slopes into town. So we modeled the 2 primary weather conditions that would support fire spread, topography, and fuel. Obviously, were unchanged for both scenarios. And as I mentioned before, we specifically look for those points where a pathway enters the populated area. So the entry point to the value of risk. And from that, we were able to inform 2 things. Which are the pathways that have the greatest risk, that represent the greatest risk to the community, and therefore should be prioritized for treatments, understanding there is a finite number of resources, a finite amount of time, a finite amount of will to act for carrying out treatments on the landscape. So we need to prioritize those to slow the pathways that have the potential to produce the greatest harm. And we also then can understand the entry points and the ember threat zones. What are the areas of the community that are going to receive that fast-moving fire, where defensible space and home hardening to reduce the vulnerability of the structure have the greatest value? Carrying out mitigations of defensible space and home hardening in the middle of town is going to have far less value than carrying out mitigations at the entry points, where those mitigations can create a buffer that will protect downstream homes, primarily from the ground component of fire spread. And so what the treatments look like along the fire pathways are a series of either vegetation treatment points, the VTPs, or splats, or a combination of utilizing existing non-burnable features, things that are already on the landscape that won't burn, that can then be augmented by a series of splats, and understanding how if we disrupt the pathways, if we interrupt the shortest distance between 2 points, and we essentially build a labyrinth through which fire will have to find its way, and that fire burns very slowly laterally. We take fire off of that primary axis of approach where the alignment of the topography, weather, and fuel will allow for fast-moving fire. If we introduce this labyrinth that will slow the fire, that will buy time. I will say, I believe emphatically, there is no such thing as treatments on the landscape that will stop fire. It just doesn't work that way. On the other hand, we can very much slow fire. And from the slowing fire, we can allow time for the evacuation of the community. We can allow time for the aggregation of the firefighting response. We can use these as anchor points or control lines from which firefighting actions can be taken to build upon the pre-fire treatments that are in place. So we have a host of opportunities, all which can be achieved through a relatively small number of treated acres, which can be matched to the available resources. And that sets up an iterative cycle. So after we've identified suitable treatment locations where we see a high probability of success with regard to disrupting the fire pathway, relatively good access, a treatment area that is far from an existing road is going to be very hard to get to, therefore more expensive, and seeking to place treatments away from steep slopes. Once again, more difficult to carry out treatments in those areas. We then run a series of prioritized treatment recommendations, looking at the difference in the rate of spread, looking at the disruption value to the fire pathway. This is having to do with tendency to make hub and degree of centrality, and looking at the potential for ember threat that's also associated with those pathways. From a series of evolutionary algorithmic assessments of the different opportunities and how can they be assessed, develop the best treatment plan spread over a 4-year cycle, understanding that by year 5, it's time to go back and update the treatments that were put in year 1, because this is a dynamic environment, the vegetation will have regrown. And from there, then we go back and evaluate the treatment plan, where we can take advantage of things such as there has been a fire, an unplanned ignition that has changed the vegetation management. There are environmental challenges that prevent a specific treatment area from being accessible. And any one of a number of other things that could go into to include the land ownership and willingness to cooperate with the project. And this runs through a series of iterations to identify the optimal treatment plan as recommended by the algorithm. And so what that looks like really is a network of strategic fuel management locations. We understand that fire spreads in a network mechanism. We need to use a similar plan where our treatments are stacked in a manner that one benefits from the presence of another, and they feed off of each other to create a comprehensive, varied fuel mosaic that mimics the natural state and will make it very difficult for fire to find a direct line. And particularly on the west side of the community, with an awful lot of grass out there, there are opportunities to integrate prescriptive grazing in conjunction with prescribed fire to really build out the value while reducing the cost and increasing the probability of out-year maintenance. A very expensive mitigation is less likely to be maintained. Mitigations that involve economic benefits, such as grazing, more likely to be maintained with fewer external resources. And once again, all of this is paired with recommendations for structural hardening retrofits and defensible space prioritization at those points of entry. So we slow the fire and we harden those points of entry. Taken together, that can dramatically reduce the community's vulnerabilities. So here's an example of how treatments are stacked at these points of entry, showing that by using selected treatment locations as opposed to either very large fuel breaks or buffers where everything within the area is modeled to be treated, we can see up to 80% of the mitigation benefit at less than 10% of the land area treated. So much more cost effective, much more environmentally conscious, much less or much more pragmatic with regard to all of the various things that limit our ability to execute and maintain large-scale treatments across the landscape. And once again, the value of these treatments is being measured in minutes gained. It will take fire longer to get to the community. And with that time, we can evacuate residents, we can respond firefighters into the area, and we give those firefighters more time to take offensive and defensive actions to disrupt the fire spread. So here's what the treatment recommendations look like for the northeast wind scenario. So we see the fire network shown in the orange lines, that be the fire pathways. We see the stacked treatment recommendations across those. We have outlined the census designated places for the values at risk, and we can see the increase in arrival time caused by the stacking of treatments along these various pathways. And here we see a similar scenario for the fire coming up from the southwest. One of the things of note is that due to the fuel type, a lot more grass out on the west side, the treatments are recommended to be pulled in closer to the community because the fire is more likely to simply burn around them out in those light flashy fuels that are capable of supporting rapid lateral fire spread, or more rapid lateral fire spread, be a good way of putting it. We also took a look at the underlying land ownership layers to understand where are the parcels that are recommended for treatment, what is the treatment type, either core treatment or grazing buffers, and then understanding federal and state land ownership, calling that out as well. And really, as I mentioned before, just we execute treatments along the pathways, we buy time for the firefighting response, and we harden the homes so that firefighters are freed up to manage the approaching fire, and fewer of them are conducting defensible space and some last-second home hardening as the fire arrives. So we free those firefighters up for firefighting actions and fire management actions by preparing those points of entry to make them more resilient. With that, I will hold for any questions, or happily hand it off to the next speaker if we're going to hold questions till the end.
Yeah, let's take a couple questions, Dave. We do have questions in the room, and appreciate it if you guys could use the microphone so our speakers can hear.
What are MTT lines?
I don't know if you heard that, Dave. She asked, what are MTT lines?
That is, sorry, make sure my camera's on here.
Slides back.
That's an excellent question. So an MTT line is a minimum time travel. So it's an output from fire modeling software showing the combination of topography, weather, and fuel that will support the most rapid fire spread. I think one of the challenges with fire modeling, and there's three factors here. We're looking at how fire is modeled, we're looking at how fire actually burns, and then we're looking at how a fire's final perimeter is reported. Fire perimeters generally end up looking very much like an amoeba, with a lot of either straight lines or close to straight lines around the perimeter where the fire was allowed to burn down to a control line of some kind, right? We don't generally go chasing the fire. We wait for the fire to come down to us. The fire doesn't burn that way, though. It makes runs where there's alignment. And the MTTs are a modeling tool to mimic the runs a fast-moving wind-driven fire would make.
Okay, why don't we? Oh, yes. Come on up. Just Dave can't hear you in the room here. And I may not capture the question right, so thank you.
Mike's not on. I can see the speaker talking, but I'm not getting any sound.
So here, go ahead, use this one. Can you hear me, Dave? Check,
Yes,
check.
I can.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
Regretting this. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, I saw that you talked about machine learning, and I was just wanting to identify the best area for treatments. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about how that works.
Yeah, great question. So it's really a matter of scale, and that if you run, a fire is a large dynamic event, and in this case, there are potentially hundreds of different pathways a fire could take into the community. And then there are thousands of potential treatment opportunities where work could be done. And machine learning is used to understand the interaction between all of the places that treatments could be placed, understanding the relative value of those, and then understanding the compounding effect of multiple treatments and iterating it using an evolutionary algorithm to identify all of it's a parent-child relationship of that. If we do this, then what does the fire look like? Because it is a fundamentally different landscape if treatments are undertaken. And then we need to run another series of simulations to simulate what fire would do if those first treatments were in place, because we've changed the underlying fuel model. And that, if you were doing that manually, you'd very quickly run into a series of limitations of how many times your modeler can sit there and click the refresh button. So machine learning is used to semi-automate that process so that we can understand all the different permutations and we can do a relative assessment of the value of this series of treatments with this series of treatments. And by the time you get done with the hundreds of pathways, the thousands of treatment of opportunities, and the hundreds of thousands of different permutations, machine learning is just a very useful tool to accelerate the process of combining those and coming up with the optimized outcomes.
Thank you, Dave. Stick around. I'm sure there's going to be many questions for you later on. So thank you for that presentation. We're going to shift now over to CoreLogic, and it'd be great if Kent, you could introduce yourself and your role and give us a little update on where you're at.
Sure, perfect. So let me launch my presentation and tell me if it's being shared. Give me a second. Okay, can you see my title slide?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, perfect. So my name's Kent David. I lead our consulting effort from CoreLogic. Our role in this project, if you've been at previous meetings, you'll have heard some of this before, but we're here to quantify, our role is to quantify the benefits of the treatments that you just heard Dave describe and discuss, with the idea that there are a large number of potential fires and fire pathways that could occur to the region. We're quantifying the benefits of these treatments on the whole array of conceivable fires that might impact the community. So we're essentially taking the work that Dave just described and kind of generalizing it with an eye on capturing the financial benefits, the reduction in risk to the community, which will then pass along to Milliman, who will speak after me. So that's the general goal. Hopping into the presentation itself. Okay, so our thesis is, and where we enter the conversation as an organization, as a company, is that we can quantify financial impacts of natural catastrophes writ large, but in this case, we're capturing the financial impacts of the wildfire phenomena as it impacts the local area, and then by doing that quantification of risk to the pre-mitigation scenario or fuel setup, and then modeling the Toyan's recommended treatments, we can, by comparing those two modeled outcomes, we can assess again the overall impact in terms of reduction of risk, financial risk to the town, to the community. So we're providing a way to evaluate and quantify those benefits holistically. We've broken down that concept into 4 main tasks that we underwent in supporting this project or this initiative. The first step is what we've been spending a lot of time in capturing since our last meeting, and that's in refining the modeling of the exposure. So in the context of this sort of analysis, what we mean by exposure is the built environment that's at risk for damage from impactful wildfires. So between CoreLogic and Milliman, we pooled our resources to capture the location characteristics and values of the homes in the affected area. So that affected area of Paradise, Concow, and Magalia, including both their characteristics, what their year built was, what the cost of rebuilding those structures would be if they were damaged, their location, and then the actual vulnerability of each structure in the area to damage from wildfire. So once we had that exposure model built, we then moved to the baseline analysis. So I'm going to the right here, which was, let's analyze this exposure using our wildfire model. And I'll get a little bit more into the wildfire model in later slides that we've discussed this in previous meetings. So I'm focusing here on kind of the cost benefit analysis we underwent. But the baseline analysis was an analysis of the exposure, but using the fuel and wildfire scenarios or environment that exists today before there's been any mitigation that Dave just described. So by establishing the baseline, we're now providing a basis for comparison. So we then implemented Toyon's recommended mitigation treatments. That was, I believe it would be safe to say, in totality, we assumed that all the treatments, the recommended treatments, were in place. The analysis did not look at the timing, the phase in, phase out. I think that, you know, the intention that you heard Dave talk about, and he can go into greater detail, is to establish a manageable and maintainable set of treatments. But what we did is we assumed that all the treatments that were recommended were in place, and then we ran this essentially the exact same analysis, the same exposure, to calculate what that impact was. So that's the last box, is the impact analysis. What we're using as a measurement for the benefits is what we call the AAL, and Milliman will talk about this in greater detail, but essentially it's the average annual loss, or the cost average out over thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years of the impact of wildfire in the community. So that's akin to kind of a pure premium that underlies an insurance policy. But by measuring this average annual loss, it's a real usable tool to establish what the benefits are to the community as a whole. Just to quickly summarize what that exposure modeling entailed, I already talked about it a little bit. We looked at the study area of Paradise, Magalia, and Concow. We modeled roughly 14,000 single-family homes. And in that modeling, we included their locations, their property characteristics, so year built, structure type, all the treatments that have been mandated to be applied to newly rebuilt houses, as well as kind of a key feature here is the estimated reconstruction cost. So when damage occurs to a property, the one way of characterizing that or looking at that from a modeling standpoint is, what is the total cost? What is the cost to completely reconstruct the property, and what percentage of that is damaged due to fire? So all of those properties go into the exposure modeling, which then goes into those analyses that I described, the baseline and then the mitigated case. So this is a slide that you might have seen before at our previous meetings. I'll go through real briefly how the modeling works. We essentially have a hazard model. The hazard model, again, considers a full range of wildfires that could impact the community, from small, relatively easily controlled fires that can still be damaging to a limited number of properties, to large catastrophic fires that are more rare, but obviously more impactful. So the hazard model is capturing what we're intending to be the full range, and also probabilities associated with the fire phenomena in the region. Again, two flavors of that. One in the unmitigated state, the current state, and then once again, the hazard model was rebuilt to reflect the mitigated case, implementing the recommended treatments. The second part of the model is the vulnerability model that reflects for every single property, every single house that we analyze, what is the amount of financial damage that would occur to that property when impacted by different levels of the wildfire phenomenon itself, including both smoke and fire. And then the loss model takes the first two components, the hazard and the vulnerability, and calculates what that financial loss is from a single fire. And then when we look at all the fires together, the whole range of fires that would impact each property as well as the community as a whole. So it's a combination of these three components that give us a way of measuring the risk to the community. And real quickly, these are the ingredients that go into the probabilistic model. I will not go through this again, but would be happy to discuss it should that be of interest to, or if anybody has any questions coming from this meeting. So I also have some illustrations that we showed before on what a typical fire looks like in our model and how it changes given wind direction, all that. But I think I will pause there and answer questions, and then we can, if there are no questions or after questions, we can move on to Milliman.
Yeah, we'll check in the room here. So if there are any questions, yes. And we'll get this set up better at the break, but perhaps you can use this microphone.
Hi there. I'm just curious to know when you talk about fuels, if you're including a scenario of a previous fire. So I keep hearing from people that, fire danger has reduced because it already burned, and how you're dealing with that kind of complexity of the newer situation where a lot of the fuels have changed recently.
Sure, thank you. So I will give you a response from our modeling perspective. I'm sure that Dave has his own response. I'll let him also respond as he sees fit. But we build our models to reflect a mid to long range view of the peril for various reasons. Mostly from an insurance standpoint, for the use of the models writ large. Stability is important, as well as the fact that fuels do grow back. So our models use a view of the fuel on the ground that's kind of a long-term or a stable view, not an immediate post-fire view of those fuels. So to some extent, that would, in the short term, overstate the risk in the region, but I think in the long run, it would be we believe it's a reasonable approach to the phenomena.
Just part of the treatments that are going to be recommended are prescribed burns. So if there's been a recent fire, then those areas would be considered treated, and we wouldn't have to treat those areas right away. It's when the growth comes back that we have to do something.
I think we'll have a chance to have some other responses to that when we get to the questions and answers. Why don't we go to Matt and Milliman? And Matt, if you could introduce yourself, your role, and what you're going to cover. Or I guess, Taylor, you're going to do it today.
Yes, I'll be doing the presentation. Matt is online. I'll give him a brief introduction too, and he'll be available for help with questions as well. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Can you all confirm you can see the presentation?
We got it. Looks good.
Awesome. So I'm Taylor Munch. I'm here with Matt Chamberlain. We're both actuaries at Milliman, which is a global actuarial consulting firm. And today we'll be discussing the actuarial portion of this project. So we have a model that helps us calculate the insurance premium based on all the great information you just heard from both Chief Winokur and Kent at CoreLogic. So how do those pathways, along with the property specific data being used in the CoreLogic model, what do we do with it from there? We'll discuss how that translates into something meaningful from an insurance perspective, specifically now for your community. So I'm going to start by giving an overview of what the actuarial model is and how it works. The goal of the actuarial model is to answer the question framed here. How does implementing the wildfire risk reduction measures discussed by Chief Winokur impact the insurance premiums that are being charged to homeowners in Paradise? We'll start by looking at the CoreLogic model output, which are the expected losses, or as Kent introduced, the AALs. So the first step is to use the model outputs to analyze these expected losses and discover how do they differ from before the wildfire risk reduction measures are put in place and after. From here, we then take the expected losses and incorporate a few more components and estimate an insurance premium. We'll talk about those components in just a minute. From there, we'll calculate the difference between the estimated premiums before and after the wildfire risk reduction to show what the actual impact on the premium would be should those risk reduction measures be followed through with. So to talk about the components that go into a premium, there are four: the wildfire pure premium, the expenses, the reinsurance costs, and the all other pure premium. The insurance premium is calculated by the model, and it's personal to Paradise because we use the expected losses from the CoreLogic model that are location-based in Paradise. They are realistic and credible because they take into account up-to-date and specific to California homeowners insurance industry data to calculate the expenses and the all other peril premium component. So let's take a deeper dive into each one of these components. We'll start with the wildfire pure premium, which comes directly from the CoreLogic model. CoreLogic provides the location-based AALs, which represent the expected economic loss on average in dollars resulting from the peril of wildfire. Using the AALs, we can calculate an average AAL, which we then call a pure premium, as the estimated amount that the insurer would have to pay out to indemnify the policyholder, not yet including any expenses or fees. This is just the pure amount that would represent what a loss would cost. Then we have the expense component, which is really made up of two components: the non-reinsurance expenses and the reinsurance expenses. The non-reinsurance expenses include the necessary costs the insurer must pay in order to do business, such as claims processing fees, marketing costs, taxes, and a profit provision. These expenses are estimated using the Insurance Expense Exhibit, or IEE, information that is published for all insurers writing homeowners insurance in California. Then there's the reinsurance component, which takes into account the cost an insurer will incur when purchasing their own insurance. Insurers need insurance to protect themselves from extremely large or high concentration losses. By purchasing reinsurance, they're pooling the risk for these type of losses. To estimate the reinsurance expense, our actuarial model uses insurance-linked securities. These are financial instruments whose price is determined by insurance-related loss, and specifically for our study, catastrophic losses. The last component is the pure premium for all other perils that are not wildfire. This is estimated using the California Homeowners Insurance Industry Fast Track data. This data set looks at premiums across the industry quarterly and segments it by state, policy form, and peril. So the values we select in the model are from the data and then will be grossed up for the non-reinsurance expenses. So what does this all lead to? We've collected data on both the specific risk and the California insurance industry trends. We've modeled the risk in 2 different scenarios to see how the wildfire risk reduction treatments impact the AALs. We've taken the AALs and created a premium by including expenses, reinsurance costs, and all other peril premium. Once the actuarial model is complete, we'll have an estimate of a hypothetical premium for a homeowner in Paradise before the treatment is considered and after it is implemented. Analyses like what we're doing here are catalysts for change in the insurance industry. We show through data collection and modeling how we can more accurately price insurance for places like Paradise that have substantial wildfire risk. If these mitigations and treatments proposed are followed through with, we'd expect the modeling of Paradise to show lower AALs, thus a lower wildfire premium component for homeowners premiums in Paradise. This all seems logical and probably sounds like great news to all of you, but how do we make the illustration done here into a reality? So to talk about that, I'm going to walk us through some current regulation and proposed regulation as to how these things are calculated in reality and what changes are on the horizon. We're going to discuss 2 specific regulations that relate directly to our project and are currently in place and have been for decades. For starters, the California Department of Insurance does not permit reinsurance costs to be included in improved rates, which is a key impediment to insurers writing business in areas of high wildfire risk in California. Including reinsurance costs and rates is very typical in other states. In this project, we can show the calculation of the estimated premium with and without the reinsurance costs reflected to show the expected deficit to insurers due to rates not being permitted to reflect the reinsurance costs. The second part is the catastrophe load, which is used in pricing to determine the expected losses for catastrophes and is currently determined based on a 20-year historical average. We'll talk about why that's problematic in a second. As for our analysis, we're not using the 20-year historical average. We're using the catastrophe model that CoreLogic presented. The California Department of Insurance does have proposed regulation underway called the Sustainable Insurance Strategy to change these things. The plan proposes the inclusion of the cost of reinsurance and the use of CAT modeling in pricing. Having these tools available and demonstrating how to use them like we're doing in our project here will help encourage more accurate pricing in the real world. So let's specifically focus on the current versus proposed way insurers can calculate the expected catastrophic losses, or what we're calling the CAT load. So currently, as I mentioned, you have to look at the 20-year historical average ratio of catastrophic losses to non-catastrophic losses. Back in days when your conditions were more stable and models weren't as advanced as they are now, this made sense and it was the best we could do. However, now that we understand wildfire risk is changing as more homes are built in wildlands and as the climate changes, we understand that looking at data from the past is not going to be predictive of the future. Also, as demonstrated by this slide, historical trends can be extremely unstable. Before including the 2017-2018 wildfires, the CAT load for a 20-year historical average was 10%. When we include 2017, it increases to 31%. When we include 2018, which was our campfire year, it increases to 70%. So this proves how unstable a historical average can be. The lack of stability And the lack of recent fire science being considered in this methodology shows that it's flawed and not as up to date as we can be. That brings me to the regulation that has been proposed to use CAT modeling in pricing. This was released just a few weeks ago in a press release completing the new wildfire modeling regulation, and it's now currently under legal review and open for public comment. On screen, I'm showing the specific wording used in the press release that describes what it is proposing. So the first bullet says, commitments that insurance companies must make in future rate filings to write more policies in wildfire distressed areas as a condition for using wildfire catastrophe modeling to more accurately assess wildfire risks they will write. So our interpretation is that CAT models, like the ones used to calculate the wildfire component in our project, can be used to calculate premium given insurance companies commit to write more policies in wildfire-prone areas. This will allow a forward-looking view on risk using the best fire science and taking into account mitigation efforts such as the ones done in Paradise. The second bullet says, it provides for the public review of models used in rate making as required under California law. So this one clarifies that CAT models will still be reviewed and vetted, because one of the big concerns that has not allowed the use of CAT models in the past is that they're not transparent. As part of this regulation, the CDI is proposing a way that CAT models can be vetted and reviewed by educated individuals. This process will give homeowners confidence that their data is being used to predict their risk in a way that is understandable and determined appropriate by several individuals who have reviewed it. It's not entirely clear to me who the reviewers will be, but that these individuals will review the CAT models under non-disclosure agreements to protect the intellectual property of the CAT model companies. So from this update, we see that the California Department of Insurance is making progress on these proposed regulations that will allow for CAT modeling like we've used here in our Paradise project. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, and Matt and I are happy to answer questions now or during the Q&A session at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Taylor. I think what we'll do is we'll go, we're getting pretty close to our timeline here. I'm going to go through a couple of items and then everyone will take a break and then we'll come back to a Q&A session. So let me get set up here for just an invitation for you guys here. Jerry? Oh, my side. Okay. So just a couple of things here. So, one of the things I think is really, there's a lot of information here and we're partially through the process, right? So some of this is a lot of introducing what is going to be done, not the findings yet. Some of the information we need. I like to think of it as kind of layers. If you're familiar with geographical information systems, you click on a button, a certain layer will pop up. But there's a lot of layers that are going to be important for us to take into account. Everything okay? Oh, I got it. Yeah. You guys don't want to see that. So anyway, just kind of continuing on with that is that we want to make sure that we capture the other things that are important to the community. So having, clearly the risk reduction associated with wildfires, very important. But there's a lot of other goals too that we want to take into account, and that'll make the project, I think, more sustainable and important for us from a long-term economic standpoint, quality of life, all the other things. So there may be some things there that has that sort of silver bullet, if you will, that may be targeted for wildfire risk reduction, especially slowing down the fire progress through the community towards the communities. But there's also other benefits we're going to have too. Some of that could be related to infrastructure and local fire response, connecting roads. Firefighters always talk about ridges and roads. So those are areas that are important, would be taken into account from more of a fire response standpoint, not necessarily across the landscape. But there's also other things that we want to make sure we take into account. Recreation, very important in our community. We hear that a lot. So if we have a trail system that helps with access to remote areas for fuels or fire response, that has added benefits and also something enjoyable for the community. There's a lot of things here that I think are analogous, important for us. Could be other land, and I don't mean land use from a planning standpoint, but uses of the land. Maybe I should say it that way. Agriculture uses, for example, that could have a reduction of risk, but also tie in with food security. So there's a lot of stuff that I think that has important local knowledge in this room that we'd want to hear. We're trying to come up with different ways to provide that information. I just give a couple of other items here. Conservation is going to be a very important item. And then maybe some of these things dovetail with each other. So there are grants out there that may be targeted for conservation purposes, but if we're thinking about it, it can be tied into a risk reduction strategy. So I think that's going to be very important for us to have multiple benefits on this to benefit the community and so forth. We have a couple of different avenues. We have a technical advisory committee. That's what the acronym is up there. So technical advisory committee, that's made up of experts. We're getting input from that may have fire expertise in the area, or partners from Butte Fire Safe Council. They've done a lot of work, probably more work than many other entities in this entire region on fire risk reduction, especially the last couple of years. So there's good expertise already here. Ways to give us that information. Talk to us tonight. We are also setting up a couple of things. We're adding more and more information to and there's a QR code in the back if you want to get access to it for community input, a little questionnaire that you can use not only for tonight's meeting, but also input on this concept in general. We want to hear from you. We are exploring a couple of options. I just give an example here, but a program that allows you to drop notes on a map. So that may be a good way of kind of collecting this information. And I did include as a prompt your neighborhood map, which is partially based on fire evacuation zones, but they're kind of lumped together. But the outer boundaries are tied in with that. Why don't we take a break? We'll kind of reconfigure our AV a little bit to take questions and input, and your input too. So let's take a quick break, and then 5 minutes, Celeste, is that us? By the way, hope that you had snacks and good conversation during the break we did here. So now we're going to open it up to some questions in the room, and we'll see who can take it. Panelists want to address the question. It'd be great if you could raise your hand, and Scott, that'll help guide Scott on it. So we will open up the floor to questions. Please come up and use the microphone.
Okay, so my first question is, are we going to see what these like raw percentages are of a property being affected by a wildfire? Okay, so, for example, First Street Foundation publishes their fire factor. So they'll give you an estimate of what is the likelihood of this property being within a wildfire perimeter, whether the property sustains damages or not. So when we can't see any of these data, there's not a lot of reason to trust any of this modeling. We can't know whether the risk is being reduced from 1% per year to 0.8% per year, for example, of a property being within a wildfire perimeter. And the other question, since we just know the Park Fire that was recently started was an active arson, the Thompson Fire that started 3 weeks before that destroyed 13 homes, that was an active arson. How can you possibly estimate the ignition frequency for angry people in cars starting fires?
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
Ken.
so I'll start, and Dave, you can follow up. use a number of sources to try to estimate wildfire frequency. We recognize that there are a lot of different sources. Frequency, severity, all of those features are variables that we include in our modeling. But are they absolutely certain? No, they're not. The modeling is an attempt to capture the range of potential outcomes.
So I'd speak for what we've done with the pathways. There's no discussion of probability of ignition or frequency of ignition. I'd point to the studies showing that at least in the Mediterranean counties of California, 97% of ignitions are anthropogenic in origin. So humans are causing them, and I think I share your skepticism on about any modeling approach that attempts to model future human behavior, particularly on something like arson or unintentional fire start. So from our perspective, the assumption is made for modeling that the fire has gotten to this point, and from there, what is likely to do. And we don't speak to probability or frequency of the occurrence. We just speak to the probability of the pathway and the minimum time travel reaching the value at risk.
I will speak to one part of that. One thing that we looked at was kind of the frequency, a little bit on the probability of weather events. So I think that's it has to have the right conditions for a catastrophic fire. And so I think that Dave, I'm curious, and Kent, your guys' ideas on, look, this is laying out from the two identified sort of worst weather conditions. So, I think it's the probability of human behavior is really difficult to assess.
Right. I would emphasize that point, saying that if we're looking to model the probability or frequency of two unknown events occurring, one being the weather, one being human behavior, those start to compound, and my confidence would go down rapidly, because it's just too hard to say whether or not it happens. And an ignition in February in the middle of a rainstorm is not going to be a catastrophic fire. So it is not only the location, but it is the timing that is critical. And then, of course, we get into all these other factors about whether or not there are treatments in place and whether or not those treatments interdict the fire. There are tens of thousands of wildfires in California in any given year, and a tiny fraction of those convert into large fires, and an even smaller fraction of those convert into those that destroy or damage a significant number of structures.
Right. We agree that there have been a number of arson fires in Butte County this summer, and most of them led to no damage. And we've had a couple that have destroyed more than 300 homes, 113 homes. So when you're trying to put this dollar value on what is the AAL delta? How much can we reduce the policyholder's premium? You have to estimate, not Dave and Toyon Labs, but the Milliman, and has to estimate what is the frequency of the ignitions that these pathways apply to. And with regards to those pathways, I just want to ask, because with the fires coming up from the bottom are going to be mostly through grass and oak woodland, and the ones from the northeast coming through Sierra Pacific industrial timberland and national forest, many of those could be crown fires with long range spotting. So I don't know, and I hope you can speak to this, about where you're having those targeted treatments. Are we talking about like crawling ground fire, or are we talking about the sort of fire that we saw in 2018 with long range spotting?
So, and the answer is both. That the pathways, especially on a wind driven pathway, the contribution of embers to speed is significant, but the contribution of embers to pathway divergence is very low. The embers generally are blown downwind, where in the same factors, now there's some exceptions to this, but particularly when you start getting into pyrocumulus and a fire that is at the point that it's creating its own weather, that's an entirely different category. So the pathways are durable, whether or not we're talking about ground component or three-dimensional ember cast. The speed, though, is definitely variable. And that's why, as I talked about before, about the network effect, and you saw the treatments are stacked, because a single treatment, there's a probability the fire will fly right over it. Or, we see this at the macro or at the micro scale, when control lines less than, a hand line or only a couple blades of dozer lines regularly fail because a tree fell across them, right? Which certainly could not be modeled. I mean, nobody's going to make, well, if we could do that, we'd be in Vegas, not in paradise, and we'd all have a lot more money in our pockets. So this is really about redundancy. And so the embers, if they don't change the pathway, and we create network effect, we then the embers will be checked up by the next treatment area. That holds true right up until we enter the community. And that's where the ember threat zones create a fundamentally different problem. But we see a log normal decay of embers over time. And so the quantity of embers matters a lot, right? Because when you get high quantity ember dispersion, they will find the vulnerabilities. They will find the receptive fuel bed, no matter how small. But that goes down, as does the quantity of embers. And that's distance becomes the factor, in that embers start to burn out rapidly. There are a finite number of things that are capable of traveling the 1 or 2 miles in advance of a flaming front that you see in long range spotting modeling. There's not very many of those things that can do that. We start talking about, like, specifically ponderosa bark plates are capable of flying that far. And the preponderance of the embers are being produced by smaller fuels and aren't capable of that kind of distribution. And so you see the ember threat start to drop off pretty quickly. Now, look, in a perfect world, every home would be built to 7A and would have up-to-date, good-to-go defensible space with zone 0 around it. But that's not the reality we live in. And so what we're looking at with the entry points is prioritization of the areas that are likely to receive the greatest number of embers, being the areas where defensible space and home hardening is of the greatest import. That is very much not to say that defensible space and home hardening isn't important everywhere. But if we are starting this problem as constrained optimization, there's a finite number of resources, there's a finite amount of community will to act, and there's a finite amount of outreach, education, incentives that are available, then we should focus those at the points of entry where the greatest risk is present, both from ground component and three-dimensional embercast. I know there's a lot there, but that, as I'm sure you're aware, that's a very complicated question when you start talking about embercast.
Dave, this came up during the break, but just the idea of the shapes that you dropped on there. I mean, those are just identifiers of location, but they could vary by what the treatment is on the ground is going to vary. The size of the polygon that actually is there, if it's, all grassland, that's a little bit different treatment than it's kind of a mixed ecotype there. So I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are, or can you explain kind of what should come next as far as identifying those polygons, ideally, and then we're going to follow up with the treatments that are going to be on that piece of ground. And then also, just maybe touch on, we're not talking parcels at this stretch. That's going to be a later stage, but kind of those earlier identifiers that you have right now, what do they look like on the ground, and what are some of the treatments that might be there?
You're exactly right that as with any good question, the answer is it depends. So breaking specifically, looking at the Western approaches and the Eastern approaches as two distinct landscapes with different fuel types. On the eastern side, those treatment areas are 13.6 acres, and they drop down to the area that is identified as the most suitable for treatment, low slope, access to a roadway, and have the greatest value. Interdict a pathway that makes it to value at risk, a high degree of centrality, high tendency to make hub. As in, if fire is slowed up at that area or potentially stopped with the introduction of firefighting resources, the fire that would have passed through there would have a significant contribution to a fast-moving fire pathway that can enter a community. Therefore, interdicting or disrupting that point will have a corresponding contribution to slowing it. On the eastern side, that works. Now, there's some specifics to how those would translate into actual work on the ground that I'll get into in a moment. On the western side, because of the prevalence of grass and light flashy fuels, it burns very differently. And in a wind-driven fire and light flashy fuels, the fire is going to self-heal very quickly. It's going to be able to make lateral movement much more quickly than it would in different fuel types. And there, the initial recommendations were just the treatment areas were not particularly effective, and that the fire was able to quickly burn around or through. Just that fuel model, cut grass behaves differently than thinned understory and clearing out ground fuels in the heavier fuels we see out to the east. So on the west side, the recommendation is for prescribed fire on a rotational basis within those areas in conjunction with prescribed grazing that buffers the prescribed fire. So a core treatment area, a prescribed fire, surrounding by a larger fuel mod where grazing, ideally cattle, just is much easier to manage and generally generate grazing fees as opposed to goats that are very expensive and require annual work to bring back. And that combination of the two in the model showed very similar effect for those treatments as the smaller, just clearing out the ground fuels on the east showed. With regard to the second part of the question of how at a later date that would translate into doing the work on the ground. The model went out and opportunistically looked for the best places to place treatments. It was unconstrained by land ownership, by property boundaries, by the environmental considerations, you name it. So as you work through where the recommended treatment areas are to an actual treatment plan, the next step is to take a look at where those treatments are crossing multiple property lines and to shift the treatment in a manner that it crosses fewer property lines. That reduces the complexity of the project. Fewer access agreements, fewer residents, fewer property owners through which coordination needs to occur. The next step would be to look for environmental exclusion areas, right? And you would want to pull treatments either upstream or downstream out of the environmentally sensitive area, or carry out the work in accordance with the constraints that are present in that environmental area of environmental sensitivity. So there's several steps that would go into translating the recommended treatments into a workable plan, but some of those are very, very dependent on local knowledge. Right? They're going to be, not all landowners are going to be equally easy to work with, and it would be very pragmatic to pull those treatments and to select those treatments that are in areas where you have a willing partner.
Thank you, Dave. Wanted to make sure everyone knew not only questions, but we wanted to make this an invitation for input too. So we'd welcome that too.
Okay. Katie Simmons, Butte County. I appreciate all of this work. I've been involved in this process for a couple of years now, and I appreciate the update. I've spent the majority of my summer in the Emergency Operations Center with Butte County for these series of fires that we've had. And on one day during the Thompson fire, we had 4 fire starts, and it was 4th of July, and you just cross your fingers. And so as much as I appreciate these models, I still haven't seen anything replicate what we actually experience in the EOC. So I just wanted to sort of add that to John's comments. But my question really pertains to the public comment period that we're in with the Department of Insurance on the sustainable insurance strategy. And a lot of local agencies are preparing comment letters specific to catastrophe models and some concerns we have over lack of transparency and, just probably the same concerns that you've heard. So as we walked through the presentation this evening, I was wondering if any of the companies involved on this panel or if PRPD is planning to submit any of this information through the public comment process so that the CDI has the benefit of, visibility into this project as they consider catastrophe modeling.
As the catastrophe modeler on the panel, I guess I'll take the question. We are planning on presenting our model to the DOI. I don't know where we stand in that process. That's a different part of the company. We are used to certifying our models in front of regulatory agencies like the Florida, the Hurricane Commission in Florida. The points you made are quite relevant. There are certainly issues of IP involved in our models, but we look forward and applaud the forward motion by the DOI to support models in the state.
Any other responses? All right. Well, yeah. So let me ask a question on that. Yeah, go ahead.
So I appreciate the response. I think for me sitting in the audience, I'm thinking, this is great for us to understand, but unless we really sort of create visibility with the regulators and sort of the folks who are thinking about using this type of data, I mean, it needs to go further than this room, right? And so I recognize that maybe other components within the companies are sort of creating visibility, but I would just encourage us to make sure that we have those, and I know we have those direct lines with the Department of Insurance, and we have local reps, and we're in contact with them every other hour. And so I would just encourage us to make sure that they have full awareness of the project and the type of data that you're using, because what we heard in the presentation tonight is far more detailed than what I think we're going to get as consumers when catastrophe models are approved. And I think that we need that kind of dialogue with projects such as these that are sort of pushing the needle and creating some additional transparency so that policyholders can reduce risk on their properties with the data that they are receiving from the insurance. Then hopefully we can achieve greater affordability and availability.
Let me just respond to something in general. I think Mark has something to say about this too. So just one of the main reasons we even embarked on this, right? There's local knowledge. We've been talking to a lot of folks in the room have shared with us information look very similar to the maps that are portrayed on the screen here. And yet, if we come to FEMA, if we come to Cal OES with local knowledge, that's not the same as have scientifically based models that are transparent and reviewed. And so the idea here is before any next steps, we need to have a good scientific background on this. And that's why we're even starting on this phase, right? This is a planning phase to see that, because we can convince locals, there could be local knowledge. That's not the same as convincing someone that may be sitting somewhere on the East Coast reviewing what the fire danger is and whether this is a good proposal or not. So that absolutely has to be the most important thing. And just one thing on the modeling is there's different questions we ask of the modeling. And so when we're asking this is looking at pathways. It's not looking at individual fire risk per parcel. That's not the intent of this. It's to look at that kind of community scale and what that might mean. So that's a bit of a different question than the individual fire risk for a community. That being said, I think that one thing that I didn't really stress at the beginning here, this was funded through FEMA, but it's a state of California project. It was submitted by the state as part of their package of proposals that they took on through the BRIC program. And so the state's very aware of this. They're keeping an eye on it. This is, better or worse, cutting edge work. And, there's not been this kind of combination of things put together, applied in this way. And folks that are on the call have worked in a lot of different areas, but this is kind of an unusual aspect. I suspect 5 years from now, this will be a standard that communities will use to evaluate their risk of their community and what they need to do. Mark, you patiently kept your hand up. We'll let you make a comment.
Thanks, Dan. As usual, Katie, your comment is spot on. There is a effort going on.
By the way, Mark, if you could introduce yourself.
Oh, Mark Northcross, NHA Advisors. We're the municipal advisor to both Paradise Recreation and Parks District in the town of Paradise, and which is a privilege to have this opportunity. So back to what I was saying, there is an effort going on, I'll call it informally, statewide, to create what is called a data commons, which is, again, the word I think that Katie uses, making this visible. And the surprise to me is that from the standpoint of the people like our people from Milliman and Kent from CoreLogic who do all the quant, there is no adequate database on the profile, the risk, or the mitigation work. So the quant people for the insurance industry really are operating, I hate to say this, in the way more in the dark than they should be. My colleague on our team here, Dave Winokur, I believe Dave is part of this informal effort to get a data commons going. And I give you one example of just, frankly, how bad it is. Marin County, where I live, voted a $200 a house tax per year It's raising about $20+ million a year. The bulk of that money is going into fuel reduction work. I mean, real live people doing, with chainsaws, whatever, doing fuel reduction work on a regular basis. That work, that significant amount of money going into mitigation of risk gets zero credit. And I mean zero credit. I'm in the insurance industry. So this means that, going back to what Katie mentioned, we aren't visible in Marin County and we're spending a hell of a lot of money. That needs to change. And we are aware of that on your team. Unfortunately, it is not a formal effort sanctioned by the state. And Dave, I don't know if you want to add anything about it. You got your hand up, so I know you have some things to add. So I will stop talking and let my colleague Dave take over.
Thanks, Mark. So I've been involved in that process for quite a while through work we've been doing with Frank Freevault and Nancy Watkins specifically. We're in the second round, grant funded, moving forward. But the comments about Marin County do require context in that the work that has been done on fuel breaks and other treatments on the landscapes is very much visible and is included in models for those modelers who choose to incorporate mitigation. Some, the state is a good example with their fire hazard severity zones, chooses not to incorporate temporal mitigations because their concern is that the stuff will grow back. And if we're using, in the case of fire hazard severity zones that are intended as a 50+ year land use planning tool, their concern is you put in a fuel break now, that doesn't necessarily buy down risk for the next 50 years. So it needs to be more durable things such as a landscape conversion because of construction or development. Grazing is actually one of the few they do get credit. What the data commons is specifically trying to address, and I think this is very relevant to this conversation and to your community, is the lack of transparency and visibility of the presence of mitigations at the parcel level. And that really is the critical element here, that as treatments are executed out in the landscape, there is a very limited amount of risk reduction that can be achieved by landscape level treatments, right? Fire is still going to be able to find a way through given enough time, and embers are certainly going to find ways to fly over. That's very much true in the case of fuel breaks, as we were talking about just a minute ago. So the most durable treatment with regard to the protection of homes and of the communities that are made up of homes is defensible space and home hardening. To the California Department of Insurance, Safer from Wildfire /NIST, HMM/IBHS Wildfire Prepared Home Standard, inclusive of a 5-foot zone 0. And that currently is not something that there is visibility around, nor if you and all of your neighbors went out and executed a bunch of home hardening and defensible space, there wouldn't be anyone you could tell about it. And that's the problem we're trying to solve for, of that when people carry out these mitigations, how are we going to ensure they have the opportunity to tell that it has been done and to verify that it has been maintained in the future? The great challenge we have on that front right now, though, is that precious few, and this isn't exclusive to Paradise, this is everywhere, precious few homeowners in our fire-dependent landscapes have carried out defensible space and either built to the 7A standard post-08 or have carried out the most meaningful retrofits, specific event replacement in conjunction with Zone 0 that is not currently enshrined in Zone 0 or in state law as part of defensible space. So I think it is what we're doing with the data commons is very important and will unlock the ability to report the completion of mitigations at scale in communities. But a precondition for that being of value is that defensible space and home hardening is happening at scale in communities. And that, as I said, I'm not aware of any community other than maybe a few isolated HOAs with more restrictive CCNRs that are at scale are carrying out these mitigations. So the work on the data commons is intended to create the pipe to which this data can flow once there is a good news story to tell. But the factor common to all on things that effectively reduce wildfire losses and associated with the reduction in wildfire losses is increases in access and affordability to insurance, is the creation of defensible space and home hardening at scale. And that really is the sticking point on our statewide path to a fire adapted future where fewer homes burn. If fewer homes burn and there are fewer losses, there will be fewer underlying issues with the insurance crisis that a lot of the regulatory reform efforts are attempting to solve.
Thanks, Steve. I'd like to add one thing, just a clarification here, and as usual, Dave is spot on, but we have a political issue here, and we have basically a revenue issue. My job is to find the money to go pay for the mitigation work, certainly at the community and landscape scale. And what the feedback we've gotten, not only in Paradise, but elsewhere in the state, is that the voters, hey, no surprise, want to see a direct connection between paying extra taxes and getting a benefit in both the availability and the cost of their homeowners insurance. What we are seeing, for one reason or another, is that right now there is no benefit going through to premium or availability of insurance. The insurance, I can speak firsthand with Marin County, let alone other places. Paying our taxes, even when we're right next to where great fuel reduction work has been done, does not result in you not getting a cancellation notice or your premium skyrocketing or going on to fair. It's just, there is no connection, and that is a very hot political issue around the state of California right now. My job is to find ways to get people in the greater Paradise community to vote yes on a tax measure, to pay for wildfire risk mitigation work at one level or another. My biggest challenge I see is that the way the system is working all in right now, it cannot deliver that benefit. It is simply not delivering that benefit. And whether it's because of lack of transparency or the way the system is set up with CDI, I am not qualified to state, but that is the problem. And that's the biggest challenge, I would say, were I pitching you as a bond finance person, for example, that you need to vote yes on a measure to fund wildfire risk mitigation in Paradise. I cannot tell you that it will directly result in a benefit to insurance in Paradise right now. And obviously that needs to change. So that's my editorial and my be transparent about what we're up against here.
So this is Matt Chamberlain. I'm an actuary with Milliman. This probably leads into when you talk about insurance, our wheelhouse. You know, the immediate benefit of reducing risk in Paradise is you have lower risk. Like you have a less likelihood of having houses burned down, and that's a benefit. But for you to get an insurance benefit, you need not just that, but also these reforms that Taylor was talking about in the regulatory environment. Because if you are not allowed, if as an insurance company, if you're, you know, she talked about how the rates have to be set over a historical average of the past 20 years. There's no mechanism, at least at the statewide level right now, for the insurance companies to reflect all the things we've been talking about in terms of mitigation. It's a backward looking approach that doesn't take into account current or future conditions, right? And so that has to change. That you have to be allowed to use catastrophe models so that you can reflect all the things that we've been talking about here, and you have to be able to reflect reinsurance cost. Because if you're not allowed to reflect reinsurance costs, and reinsurance cost is material, then you are losing money. And if you have a mitigation, if there's some mitigation done, and you're required to charge a price that's where your profit is negative, and then you're supposed to discount off of that negative profit, that's not going to work. The rates have to be adequate before you can start reflecting these sort of things. So the immediate benefit is reduction in risk. Once the regulatory reforms are implemented, then that opens up the potential to also get an insurance benefit. And I think, you know, in terms of the question about submitting comments to the California Department of Insurance, I think that the most powerful comments will come from consumers and from people in Paradise saying like, we want cat models to be reflected. We want the cost of reinsurance to be reflected, because that is going to make it more likely that we are able to get insurance. I think the concern about cat models that everyone has is it's not a concern about whether the cat modelers or the actuaries think they're okay. It's a concern from the public, and so I think comment from the public in favor of this is going to be more powerful. And I guess the other thing I'll say is cat models are widely, I said this at the prior community meeting, that they are widely used in almost every state, including states with strict regulation like Florida. This can be done. There are issues with intellectual property that have to be reflected, and those, maybe Kent will want to speak to this as well, but like those issues can be addressed in a way that I think no one's going to say that in Florida they have a lax regulatory environment, and yet you can use cat models there. I don't see why it can't be done in California too.
And I just want to amplify the fact that what Dan said earlier about multiple benefits, I like to think of it as multiple benefits for the community. Safety is the number one thing, where we reduce, as Matt and Mark and Ken have been saying, we reduce the risk of wildfire to the community overall. But we're taking a real holistic approach here. And, as Dan said, we're looking at recreational access in areas that haven't had it before. And that access can also act as access for firefighters to get to these areas, and access for maintaining those properties that we're going to identify. And also, if we connect those areas with pathways for them to get to treat the priority parcels, then those paths, those recreational trails can also be fire breaks in and of themselves. So there's multiple benefits. The other benefit is that it is multiplying the avenues of funding for getting all of this work done. We can go for recreational dollars for the pathways, the recreational access. We can get environmental funds for doing native planting in certain areas to replace some of the invasive species. And to Katie's point, the state is very aware of what we're doing here. One of the updates we have for you tonight is that we have an additional grant from the state of California to continue this work, to bring it to fruition of an implementation plan for these buffer zone priority parcel treatments, and the plan to implement those and to find the funding. And we're working with the Butte County Wildfire Council, because as Dan said earlier, they're already doing some of the initial work in treating areas throughout the greater Paradise region with funds they've already gotten for fire safety. So it just is building upon each step that we're going through and trying to get this done. And the point was made to me that if we need to get the data refined and show the scientific basis for what we're doing before we can take it and present it to anyone. So we have to bring it to fruition. Otherwise, it's premature data, and we don't want to do that.
Just one other thing. Katie's question, obviously very fruitful, because we're asking a lot of comments there, are getting a lot of responses. One thing I was going to add, Katie, is early on, the genesis of this project, we were actually looking at connecting with Sonoma County and with Ventura County at the time. And we just had to love that opportunity to, in fact, we had that opportunity to create a little bit of a peer network with them. You guys have been the county, very effective at being able to communicate locally. It'd be great if we had a partner partnership with you guys to help us with those connections with the other counties and places that are doing similar work, but not quite the same. And there's some other questions. Oh,
I'm Alan Nazaro. I'm with RCAC, and we're project managers on this project.
thank you. Thank you for that. Let's see, any other questions, comments, and we'll certainly take them afterward. Katie, did you have any follow-up you want to do? Okay. So why don't we do this? Want to be respectful of people's time. We will stick around for questions, interaction, looking at maps, whatever you may want to do while we have folks in the room. And we can certainly convey questions to our team there. But I wanted to thank the team for really great presentations and looking for good work to come. So I just give a little thank you for everyone on the team there. There will be additional follow-ups. Yes, ma'am.
The next presentation.
Yeah, good question. Do you want to? Some of this depends on information that comes out.
Right. As soon as we finish all of the modeling and have our results and run it through our technical advisory committee, then we'll be having another meeting, hopefully within the next couple of months.
And that actually is good input for us. So if you guys can share good avenues to get out information, we're glad that you guys got the word on this. And it does seem to be a great interest in the community. So I think the next phase is people understand what it regards and some of the findings. We'll start getting some more information, but let us know what good avenues of getting that word out is. And Celeste, I think you wanted to talk about this. Sir, if you could use a microphone.
There's a survey in your guys' packet, and if you take the survey, then I can personally email you any updates for the next community meeting. And by the way, I'm Celeste. I work with RCAC. I work with Alan and Jennifer over here.
Word gets out, you may need more chairs.
Yeah, we'll set up more chairs and maybe different avenues to get information out to. But we are recording it. Sunny in the back has a QR code that takes you to a questionnaire in our webpage. It's also in the packet. Thank you. But thanks all. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Sunny. Thanks, Susan, for the food, and Tony for the catering service from Town of Paradise. Thank you, team, for joining us today.